The PlayStation 2 wasn't just home to blockbusters like GTA or Final Fantasy. It was also a breeding ground for ambitious experiments that pushed the limits of what open worlds could be. Some of these titles slipped under the radar, overshadowed by giants of the era, while others earned cult followings but were quickly forgotten as the industry moved on. What ties them together is the way they blended freedom, chaos, and creativity long before open-world formulas were perfected. Today, we're dusting off those hidden gems you probably forgot about. If you end up liking the content, please subscribe for more, and I'd appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up and tell me what you think down below. Love to hear it.
I don't know how to work them either.
Steambot Chronicles was the kind of quirky sandbox the PS2 era quietly hid. At first glance, it looks like a simple mech game. Pilot steam-powered trotmobiles around a coastal city, take odd jobs, and clear bandit camps. Dig a little deeper, and you'll find an unusually generous experiment in player freedom. The title blends open-world exploration, light RPG progression, and life sim beats into one package, and it constantly asks a small, useful question. What does it mean to live in this world? What makes it genuinely interesting is how its systems interlock. Trot mobile customization isn't only cosmetic. Parts change handling and combat performance. So scavenging and trading matter. NPCs keep daily schedules and react to your reputation. Help a merchant today, and a chain of opportunities can open later. Act like a bully, and entire quest threads shut. There's a surprising variety of side activities too. You can form a band and perform rhythm game shows to build popularity, run trading routes for steady income, or pursue low-stakes romances that feel earned because they grow from repeated interactions rather than scripted beats. It's not a flawless classic. Combat can be clumsy, some mission types repeat, and the English localization occasionally trips over idioms. But those rough edges give the game a handcrafted charm most polished AAA titles lack. The cel-shaded aesthetic and small-scale neighborhoods make the world feel intimate, and the satisfaction of discovering a rare part or unlocking a secret performance-based lands precisely because the environment behaves like a mini-society rather than a checklist of objectives. Today, it reads like an early prototype of genre hybrids we see now. Life sim meets open-world RPG with emergent social loops. If you skip it on PS2 because it looked odd or unpolished, give it a shot. It's not perfect, but its heart, curiosity, and interwoven systems make it one of the era's most inventively stubborn experiments. Draken the Ancient's Gates remains one of the PS2's boldest efforts to fuse grounded third-person action with true aerial freedom. Playing as Rhine alongside her dragon companion Aroke, you switch seamlessly between on-foot exploration and dragonback flight. And the moment you mount Aroke, the whole game world reframes itself. Valleys become flight lanes, fortresses become aerial obstacle courses, and combat scales into swooping dogfights and strafing runs. That sense of verticality, so rare on consoles at the time, gives Draken a thrill many contemporaries simply couldn't match. On foot, the game delivers sturdy action RPG fundamentals, weighty sword strikes, magic that changes how encounters play out, and handcrafted dungeons stuffed with secrets. Level design rewards curiosity. Hidden tombs and optional ruins hide artifacts that meaningfully upgrade abilities, and the combat's tactile feel makes each successful dodge or parry satisfying. Then you climb into the saddle and the gameplay shifts. Aerial combat requires spatial thinking, speed control, and carefully timed breath attacks. Dogfights against rival dragons force you to weave, bait, and punish, which makes those mid-air duels memorable rather than just cinematic set pieces. Progression ties rider and dragon together. Rhine gains new gear and magic, while Aroke learns breath attacks and defensive maneuvers, encouraging players to experiment with different strategies. The bond between rider and dragon lends emotional weight. Small, quiet moments make the partnership feel earned and give the game a surprising heart under all the action. It isn't flawless. The camera can struggle during tight canyon runs. Hit detection is occasionally inconsistent in frenzied clashes, and some textures show their age. Still, those technical wrinkles don't erase its achievements. It's a PS2 relic that rewards players who crave varied traversal, cinematic airborne set pieces, and a well-earned rider and dragon relationship. before superhero open worlds became industry staples. The Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction quietly set a bar that wouldn't be matched for years. Released in 2005, it gave players something surprisingly rare at the time: a destructible sandbox tailored entirely to a single character's identity. You weren't just running around a city with generic powers. You were the Hulk, a force of physics and chaos, and the game bent itself around that fantasy in a way no tie-in had before. What made it remarkable was the sheer fluidity of destruction. Cars could be torn in half and used as boxing gloves or welded into makeshift shields. Lampposts became javelins. Buses turned into skateboards. Entire city blocks could crumble beneath your fists, and it felt liberating. Even more impressive, this wasn't shallow spectacle. The game built combat systems around Hulk's strength, layering in combos, grabs, and improvised weaponry so that every fight felt like a playground. It embraced experimentation and let players shape chaos in their own style. Traversal was equally revolutionary. Hulk sprinted across highways, scaled skyscrapers in seconds, and leapt miles into the air. The simple rhythm of running, jumping, and wall climbing felt exhilarating long before the new Spider-Man popularized momentum-based traversal again. Even now, the sense of freedom compares favorably to more polished modern superhero games. And while the story leaned into comic book melodrama rather than subtlety, it did the one thing a Hulk game needed. It constantly gave you excuses to smash bigger things, from tanks to skyscraper-sized machines. Of course, it had rough edges. The graphics look primitive today, mission variety isn't the deepest, and boss fights sometimes leaned on repetition. Yet none of that dulled its achievement. It remains one of the few superhero games that fully captured the raw essence of its character, letting players revel in destruction instead of nerfing it for balance. At a glance, SSX3 might not seem like it belongs in a discussion of open-world games, but once you dive in, it becomes clear why it deserves the title. Released in 2003, this snowboarding classic ditched the segmented tracks of its predecessors and instead stitched everything together into a single massive mountain. You weren't selecting levels from a menu anymore. You were strapping on a board and carving your way down an interconnected peak where exploration was just as important as racing. The scale was staggering for the time. You could ride from the summit all the way to the base in a single seamless run, weaving through multiple regions with their own hazards, shortcuts, and hidden routes. Events and challenges were scattered throughout, but the mountain itself became the star, a living playground where the thrill came not only from competition, but from discovery. That structure gave it an open-world energy closer to Burnout Paradise. Mechanically, it hit a sweet spot between accessibility and depth. Tricks were wild and over the top, yet chaining them together required genuine skill. The Uber trick system rewarded creative combos, and the physics struck that arcade-perfect balance. Loose enough for spectacle, tight enough for mastery. Exploring off the beaten path often rewarded players with opportunities for outrageous stunts or shortcuts that shaved seconds off timed events. What set it apart was its atmosphere. The soundtrack dynamically shifted depending on how intense your ride became. The radio-style commentary reinforced the illusion of a living mountain, full of culture and personality. It was immersive in a way that few sports titles even attempt. The series eventually drifted toward gimmicks and lost its core identity. But SSX3 remains a defining example of how an open world can elevate even a sports game. It blurred the line between racing, trick-based gameplay, and exploration, giving players not just challenges but freedom. If you've ever wondered what it would look like if someone mashed Grand Theft Auto with a Robert Rodriguez film, Total Overdose, A Gunslinger's Tale in Mexico has your answer. This leaned fully into over-the-top spectacle. It was a game that didn't care about realism or polish. It cared about being stylish, chaotic, and fun. Set in a caricatured version of Mexico, you were thrown into a story of drug cartels, corrupt officials, and family drama. The plot wasn't subtle, often veering into cliché, but it served as the perfect excuse for ridiculous action sequences and explosive missions. Gunfights were the game's lifeblood, and this didn't just imitate the run-and-gun formula. It elevated it with its signature mechanic. the Loco Moves. These were absurd cinematic power-ups that turned firefights into slow-motion ballets of destruction. You could dive through the air while unloading twin pistols, spin like a tornado of bullets, or summon an explosive piñata that wiped out enemies in a colorful blaze. It was gleefully excessive and made every encounter memorable. The open world itself wasn't enormous by today's standards, but it was dense with personality. Town squares, dusty highways, and cartel compounds all had their own flavor, and players could freely cause chaos between missions. Driving cars across the rugged terrain or mowing down waves of enemies with improvised weapons gave the game a sense of playful anarchy. It wasn't about realism. It was about giving players toys and letting them blow things up in increasingly ridiculous ways. Of course, the rough edges were there. The world wasn't particularly reactive, the AI could be laughably bad, and the graphics looked outdated even in 2005. But those flaws became part of its cult appeal. But people loved it because it was messy, brash, and fun in ways more serious games often weren't. It dared to embrace video game logic over realism, and in doing so, carved out its own quirky space in open-world history. Imagine if Twisted Metal had an open world, then layered on a grim, post-apocalyptic atmosphere, and you'll get something close to roadkill. Released in 2003, this vehicular combat game blended driving mayhem with sandbox freedom in a way that still feels distinct. At a time when car combat was fading, it doubled down and expanded it into a living world filled with rival gangs, dark humor, and explosive battles. Set in a ruined society where civilization has collapsed, you took control of Mason Strong, a driver just trying to survive amidst warring factions. The city itself was divided into gang-controlled zones, each with its own look and feel, and moving between them meant navigating hostile territories where ambushes were common. It wasn't just a racing track, it was a dangerous ecosystem. Missions involved assassinations, deliveries, escorting allies, or simply wreaking havoc on rival gangs, and each one contributed to the game's chaotic atmosphere. Combat was the centerpiece. Vehicles came bristling with weapons and could be upgraded as you progressed. The sheer satisfaction of tearing through enemy convoys while dodging incoming fire captured that old-school vehicular carnage spirit. But unlike Twisted Metal, which was arena-based, it gave you freedom. You weren't locked into a single map. You were free to roam, pick fights, or stumble into encounters organically. Where this stood out was in its tone. The writing leaned into pitch-black humor, filled with radio chatter, satirical commentary, and grim jokes about the end of the world. It was bleak, but it never took itself too seriously, finding humor in chaos. The presentation was rough, and the physics could feel clunky, but the personality was undeniable. Unfortunately, it came and went without making a huge impact, overshadowed by bigger open-world titles and dismissed for its lack of polish. But beneath the grit and jank was a game that understood how to turn vehicular combat into an immersive sandbox.
Kill anyone who betrays my trust.
Before Just Cause or Far Cry made blowing up everything in sight standard fare, there was Mercenaries' Playground of Destruction. Released in 2005 by Pandemic Studios, this gave players the ultimate playground, a fully destructible open world where chaos wasn't just encouraged, it was the whole point. Set in a fictionalized North Korea, you played as one of 3 mercenaries for hire, each with different skills and personalities, dropped into a volatile environment where factions vied for power. Instead of choosing one side, you're free to play them all against each other. This faction-based sandbox was revolutionary. Help one group, and you'd earn rewards, betray them, and suddenly you'd be dodging their patrols. The world felt alive with shifting allegiances and unpredictable consequences. But the real star was the destruction system. Buildings, bridges, vehicles. If you could see it, you could probably blow it up. Airstrikes, rocket launchers, tanks, and even hijacked helicopters gave you an arsenal of mayhem, and the game encouraged you to experiment. Missions often provided broad objectives, but left the approach up to you. The Deck of 52 system was another clever innovation. Enemy leaders were represented as playing cards scattered throughout the world, and hunting them down became an addictive metagame. Capturing or killing these targets for cash rewards gave players freedom to tackle challenges in any order, adding another layer to the sandbox chaos. Of course, the game wasn't perfect. Its AI could be laughable, missions occasionally repetitive, and the story was more an excuse for action than a compelling narrative. But none of that mattered when you were calling in an airstrike on an entire city block or chaining explosions across a battlefield. Mercenaries understood something that many open-world games still struggle with. Sometimes the pure joy of play comes from giving players tools and letting them cause beautiful, spectacular destruction. If GTA defined American-style open worlds, The Getaway Black Monday aimed to do the same for London. Released in 2004, this follow-up to The Getaway attempted something bold, a cinematic, ultra-grounded crime story merged with an open-world recreation of a city, where Rockstar leaned into satire and chaos. This took a far more serious approach, one that was both ambitious and divisive. The game put players in the shoes of multiple protagonists, an Xboxer named Eddie, a detective named Mitch, and a street racer named Sam, whose stories intertwined across a gritty narrative of crime, corruption, and betrayal. This multi-perspective storytelling was ahead of its time, laying groundwork that Rockstar themselves wouldn't embrace until GTA 5. Missions had a distinctly cinematic flair, often flowing seamlessly between gameplay and cutscenes, and a lack of a traditional HUD added to the immersive feel. No health bars, no minimap, no ammo counter. You had to read the world itself to survive, like checking your car's indicators or judging a character's injuries by their posture. Driving through London was one of the highlights. The recreation of the city was painstakingly detailed, with recognizable landmarks and an authentic atmosphere that set it apart from the fictional playgrounds of other open-world games. Combat and shooting sequences were tense, though often criticized for clunky controls and frustrating AI. Still, they fit the game's tone of grounded realism, trading arcade-like chaos for something slower and more deliberate. The ambition was undeniable, but so were the flaws. Its awkward mechanics, stiff animations, and storytelling that sometimes veered into melodrama. Yet those same rough edges gave it a distinct character. It wasn't trying to be slick, it was trying to be immersive. Players willing to push through the jank often found a narrative experience far more serious and atmospheric than most open worlds. When people think of GTA competitors, True Crime Streets of LA almost always comes up. Released in 2003, it wasn't shy about presenting itself as Rockstar's rival. Another gritty, crime-driven sandbox with cars to jack, pedestrians to harass, and a sprawling city to explore. But True Crime carved its own identity with one big hook, a full recreation of Los Angeles. Freeways, neighborhoods, landmarks. This wasn't a generic city. It was LA, mapped out and open to roam. What made it stand out wasn't just scale, but the ambition to mix genres. The game mashed together driving, shooting, and even hand-to-hand combat into one package. One mission might have you gunning down thugs in a nightclub, the next chasing a car down the 405, and then suddenly you're brawling in an alley with martial arts combos. That variety was exciting, even if not every system was equally polished. The gunplay could feel clunky, melee sometimes stiff, but the sheer novelty of mixing it all together made it memorable. It also introduced something unique for the time, a branching storyline. Depending on your choices, whether you went full loose cannon cop or try to play it straight, the story could shift with multiple endings. It gave players a sense of ownership over the narrative in a way few open-world games dared back then. Of course, True Crime wasn't flawless. The world felt empty compared to GTA's lively chaos. Missions could drag with repetition, and the morality system was often more frustrating than rewarding. Still, it dared to experiment, and that's why people still remember it. It wasn't the GTA killer it wanted to be, but it left behind a legacy as one of the most ambitious PS2 open-world titles of its time.
Walking in.
Licensed games rarely broke free of mediocrity, but Scarface the World is Yours was a rare exception. Released in 2006, it asked the boldest what-if of all. What if Tony Montana survived a mansion shootout at the end of the movie? From there, it let players step back into the world of Scarface, building an empire from scratch across Miami. What immediately set it apart was how well it captured the fantasy of being Tony Montana. The game leaned into excess, swagger-filled dialogue, over-the-top action, and empire-building systems that turned your rise to power into something more than just a string of missions. You could launder money, expand turf, run fronts, and use your growing empire to unlock new weapons and allies. It blended the open-world chaos of GTA with management-light mechanics that made you feel like you were truly running a criminal empire. Combat was brutal, stylish, and drenched in attitude. The ball's meter rewarded aggressive play, taunting enemies, going in guns blazing, until you could unleash a rage-fueled slaughter. Vehicles, from cars to boats, gave plenty of ways to cause chaos, and the world itself was packed with cartel rivals to take down. Miami felt alive with the kind of neon-soaked danger you'd expect from a Scarface adaptation. But it wasn't perfect. Controls could feel dated, enemy AI wasn't particularly sharp, and the Empire systems sometimes boiled down to repetitive busywork. The voice acting also raised eyebrows. Since Al Pacino didn't reprise the role, an impersonator took over. Luckily, the performance was good enough that most players roll with it. In the end, Scarface stood out because it didn't just retell the movie, it expanded it. It gave players the chance to live in that world, to rewrite Tony's fate, and to build something bigger. For a licensed open-world game on PS2, that was almost unheard of, and it's why the world is yours remains one of the console's boldest crime sandboxes.
He's putting the squeeze on all this.